our first presentation is by Salma Valadez Marquez, who is a PhD student in Romance Languages and an MA student in Folklore, specializing in Mexican and Mexican-American foodways. Her dissertation project, Mexican-American Food and Lore Beyond the Fictions We've Been Fed, very creative title, analyzes how food is used to tell stories about migration, displacement, and identity. Let's welcome Salma.
What a cute intro, thank you. You made me sound so whimsical. Whimsical. Oh, you flatter me. Okay, so hi everybody, I'm Salma, and I'm going to talk briefly about this fascinating woman right here, Josefina Velásquez de León. So I start with a quote of hers. This comes from one of her many cookbooks, and she says, roughly translated, Mexican cuisine is very varied. It's tied to customs and the climate and the spirit of la raza. La raza, the race, but there's a heavier connotation when she's talking about raza here. So this is how I was introduced to Doña Josefina Velásquez de León. So a little biographical background of who this woman is and why she's so important. She was born to a wealthy, upper middle class family in Aguascalientes in 1899. She is a prolific Mexican cookbook author, educator. She has published more than 140 cookbooks throughout the 20th century. Some of them that we're still discovering till today. I had the opportunity, thank you to CLLAS for funding me, to go visit the archive in the University of Texas, San Antonio, that houses the largest single collection of her books. So this is part of a larger dissertation project. This is a chapter, and I want to tell you a bit about her and why she's very important. So her first book was published in 1936 called Practical Manual of the Kitchen, or Manual Práctico de la Cocina. The year after, she established her own imprint called Ediciones Josefina Velásquez de León. So she was very protective of her work. She also hosted her own radio show called The Laziness in the Kitchen, or La Flojera en la Cocina, in 46. And most notably, she published a bilingual Mexican cookbook called Mexican Cookbook Devoted to American Homes in 47. As far as we know, she was the first one to do a bilingual cookbook. She also had a TV show called The Menu of the Kitchen, or El Menú de la Semana, in 1950 that ran for a couple of years. With her radio show and her TV show, there are no recordings left, at least in the public domain. So if you guys know, a rich, obscure collector who may have tapes, please let me know, because these are very valuable. And she had her own cooking school in Mexico City. This is a flyer from one of her books that she included. She advertised a lot of herself in her cookbooks. So her work played a very key role in shaping culinary norms across class lines, offering a standardized idea of what Mexican food was or what it should be. So let's establish some terminology here. So I refer to her as Doña Josefina because that is her alias. She used this a lot in her radio show and her TV show. She presented herself as Soy la Doña Josefina Velásquez de León. The reason I do this is because we need to separate the public persona from the actual woman. We actually don't know much about Josefina Velásquez de León. All that's left is a interview her nephew did in the late 70s where he talks a bit about what he remembers about her as a child, but she never gave any interviews and she never wrote an autobiography, so she's kind of a mystery. I also use Doña Josefina as a title of empowerment. It reminds us that she wasn't just a cookbook writer, she was a cultural broker, shaping how Mexican households and the nation itself thought about food, gender, and identity. So Doña Josefina's impact goes way beyond the printed page. Her cookbooks, I argue in this chapter, aligned with Mexico's one-party government, the Revolutionary Institutional Party, which I will hereby refer to as the PRI, that was consolidated in 1929. So a bit of a brief history lesson here. From about 1910 to about 1917, 18, some historians agree that Mexico's revolution reached its most turbulent time. This means the government was practically in shambles, rising up against a 30-year dictatorship that started around 1870 to around 1910, give or take. So the government was practically broken, but the parties united under this idea of revolutionary institutional party, very vague term, trying to form a new government. They went through many versions of this, but in 29 they consolidated under that name. Okay, back to Josefina. So through her work, she helped promote a vision of Mexican national identity that aligned with the state's project of unification and modernization. Undoubtedly, after such a revolutionary and turbulent time, the idea of unification was something somewhat fluid, and especially modernization. But this happened often at the expense of Indigenous and Afro-Mexican rural communities and their culinary practices. In this way, she is both a documentarian of tradition and an architect of nationalist culinary narratives. This is just a little prologue that she tends to include in her books, and she always included a picture of herself. So, like I mentioned, this is part of my larger dissertation project that analyzes food discourses around ingredients and dishes, both in the US and Mexico, and the impact such discourses have had on and continue to have on the Mexican American community. So the decolonial approach that influences how I approach my work, as well as the theoretical basis, is informed by Chicano scholarship and indigenous scholars, and it's geared towards a reclamation or a remembering, and by remembering I mean re-membering of history through foodways. So the project argues that Josefina Velásquez de León, widely regarded as a foundational figure in Mexican culinary literature, played a key but very overlooked role in academia in the cultural nation-building efforts of Mexico's post-revolutionary one-party regime. Remember the PRI. Through her cookbooks, Doña Josefina helped shape a state-sanctioned vision of Mexican identity that reformulated indigenous and African food practices as mestizo, aligning with the PRI's agenda of unity and modernization. And by examining her culinary text, this research reveals how food was mobilized as a political tool, erasing marginalized voices while promoting an idea of national coherence. So let's get to the actual fun stuff. Analyzing her. So she accomplishes this two ways, her work rather. And I asked myself, what do Doña Velásquez's books tell us about Mexican cuisine? What is she selling to us, particularly regional cuisine, and what is the effect? So let's contextualize her. The era in which Doña Josefina was the most active is pivotal in Mexican history. It marked the solidification of the PRI's one-party dictatorship that lasted about 70 years, which sought to legitimize the party through a cultural project that included appropriating indigenous tradition, such as mariachi, danza folklorica, fashion was also a victim of this, and presenting them part of a unified mestizo identity. So when I say Doña Josefina and her legacy is an extension of the Mexican state, I don't mean that Doña Josefina was an active politician. Rather, I suggest a positioning of power that operated quietly, intimately, and in this case, on our plates. So, further contextualizing Doña Josefina, a widow who never remarried in her mid-20s, within the larger institutions she navigated, including radio, television, and printing, they were all sanctioned by the states. For example, let's remember that film scripts at this time were all reviewed and approved by the Secretaría of Gobernación, which translates to like the Ministry of Governance, very similar to what we have today. This is why Mexico's Golden Age and Golden Age films tend to revolve around similar themes of a small town rising up against the state. They kind of all blend into one. Let's remember also that leftist writers like Jose Revueltas was blacklisted and jailed multiple times. Argentinian filmmaker Raimundo Gleiser, with his very controversial documentary La Revolución Congelada, was one of the disappeared during the Dirty War in Argentina. Not to say that, his film La Revolución Congelada followed Luis Echeverria's, another very prominent PRI candidate in 1971, while giving a very explicit criticism. Not to say that's like directly linked, but you know, the evidence speaks for itself there. And also political theater was particularly showcased the struggle of indigenous communities was often very violently repressed. But at the same time, Mexico's rapid industrialization produced a new urban middle class, and cookbooks, often sanctioned or state promoted, became tools in teaching this new class with money how to be Mexican through food. So this included reformulating indigenous and African dishes as mestizo or European, effectively erasing their origins while promoting an illusion of national harmony. Let's also take some time to look at the intellectual sentiment towards indigeneity in Mexico in the decades surrounding Doña Josefina's career. For example, in the 1920s, social engineer, which is not a real title, it's sort of a pseudo-scientific title that was given to you under the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, but Francisco Bulnes just kind of kept it around for a while after that. He was a social engineer and very prominent writer, pre and post-revolutionary. He took a very staunch critical role in the Mexican indigenous classes, particularly their diet, blaming corn and beans and other milpa foodstuffs as unhealthy, weakening the shortening lifespans of indigenous people, who then he blamed for Mexico's slow industrialization compared to Europe. He argued that the diet, a dietary and agricultural transformation in favor of wheat, arguing that if Mexico wanted to catch up with Europe's modernization, it should be eating like them, in this case, eating bread. Similarly, Samuel Ramos, the profile of man and culture in Mexico, El perfil del hombre y la cultura en México, published in 1934, aimed to develop a very weak theory explaining the true character of the Mexican people and culture, identifying a national inferiority complex rooted in the trauma of Spanish conquest and colonization. He uses the figure of el pelado. Pelado is like a vulgar, lower class, uneducated male, has the embodiment of this complex, describing him as aggressive, crude, emotionally driven, yet clinging to exaggerated notions of masculinity as a substitute for social and personal worth. For Ramos, el pelado demonstrates how Mexicans internalize shame while projecting bravado, equating virility with national identity as a coping mechanism for historical and social marginalization. So, in sum, you could tell that the attitudes and sentiments towards indigeneity were based on the idea of pity and tragedy, but embedded within white saviorism. That is to say, white intellectuals had the duty of elevating the indigenous community out of their misery, so to speak, and were also a burden to national progress. So, okay, finally, let's get to the actual fun stuff, the text. So all of these were housed under UTSA in San Antonio. Shout out to them, they were so kind and so underfunded. When I went there, it was during a very rainy week, and they had buckets like throughout the library just to catch it. So fund more libraries. So anyway, the genre of cookbooks. So it's goes beyond words to say that, you know, the genre of cookbooks is very inherently classist. Because who actually needs a cookbook? Well, first you have to be literate in order to consume a textbook. You have to have access to resources. That means ingredients. So you need either a plot of land to grow multiple ingredients or the money to buy those. So they are not of the lower classes. For example, I learned to cook from my mother who grew up in a rural community. We never had cookbooks. Still to this day, I don't really use cookbooks to cook. Anyway, when we contextualize this with the rise of a burgeoning middle and upper classes, along with the expansion of the national highway in Mexico, which started around the 50s and wasn't completed until the 60s, which allowed for a lot of domestic travel, the genre of cookbooks became very popular around this era. Doña Josefina, she had multiple series, some based on particular events like quinceañeras or weddings, some based on new technology like the mixer or the blender or the electric oven. She was a jack of all trades, she did it all. But the one I was most interested in and the one the archives house more are these ones, the regional cookbooks. She didn't do all of the states in Mexico, but she did many of them. And it's unclear where she got the funding to do this. We're given some hints in the prologue. She said she was invited by a council of a city or a town. In some cases, the prologue is written by a mayor, so we know that's linked to funding. But her nephew does give some clues saying that Doña Josefina traveled with her sisters, which there is evidence that her sisters were her assistants, and that they traveled solely out of their own money because they wanted to just know these places. So it's unclear, but we know she was very in touch with the people. In some of these recipes, they are tied to specific contributors. She does name them, but we know nothing about them other than their names. In most of the cases, none of them are attributed though. Okay, so let's start by analyzing the material themselves. These books are very cheaply bound. It's a very thin cardboard that holds them together and the glue is falling apart at the seams. So you have to be very careful when you are handling this material. Additionally, there's a lot of pages missing in a lot of these books, seeing there were advertisements for her classes or for certain, we predict that for a certain new cooking technology like a blender was included within the books, but there are a lot of missing pages as well. So what does this tell us? Well, this tells us that these books were meant to be bought frequently. Many of these books were published in the same year, meaning she had a reoccurring series. So people were encouraged to buy these and dispose of them and buy some more. She was a very prolific writer. There's no standard format for these. Sometimes a guest, like a mayor, would write a prologue, very short, talking about the region, often thanking their contributors and guides. Most of them are unnamed. But more often she wrote the prologues herself. Very generic prologues that praise the variety of dishes, the beauty, the flora, the fauna of the states. Thanks her contributors, sometimes. And her recipes, which was unique to Doña Josefina at the time, include precise measurements. Prior to this, if you looked at some cookbooks, they were a little bit more expensive bound. They last a lot longer. They're actually in better condition than some of these newer ones. It's written sort of in prose, just a vague paragraph. Sometimes it includes quantity of ingredients, often it doesn't. But Doña Josefina was explicit. She explained in her prologues, I include precise measurements to create the correct dish in its correct form. So let's also read the art. So I read it as the packaging as cosplay. So this, let's call her this white woman. She appears in a lot of these cookbooks, not all of them, but she's very prominent. So here we see her, this either copper or blonde, blue-eyed or brown-eyed woman, very white. Here she is crabbing in Veracruz. Here she is overlooking that's a tamal that's made with a whole chicken or a whole turkey. So she's overlooking it. And if you zoom in on her foot, do you see her shoe? She's wearing heels. She's a fraud. So let's look at some more. So here she is in Campeche, overlooking the ocean, again in traditional dress. The Oaxaca one probably makes me laugh the most. It's like either you laugh or you cry when you see it. So here she is with friends. This is the first time we see her with her 3 white friends. Look all the way in the back. Do you see her? That's the only actual Oaxacan, and she's all the way in the back. But what's front and center is this white woman. She's barefoot now, traditional dress, doing a traditional dance. Here she is again in Michoacan. This time she has a baby tied to her. Again, she's overlooking the bay. And here she is in Jalisco dancing a tapatío. So what does this tell us besides, the explicit argument that indigeneity is a costume white people put on themselves? Well, it gives us this idea that this white upper class is now inserting themselves into indigenous spaces, indigenous practices, without indigenous people. Let's go back to Oaxaca, the one that makes me cry and laugh at the same time. She's all the way in the back. She's not participating at all. Well, it tells us that they want the indigenous practices, the indigenous fashion, through a lens that romanticizes also indigeneity. In all of these, she's either kind of looking forlorn towards the ocean, like a distant gaze, or, engaging in a happy dance. But there's no depth. There's nothing about this actually tells us about the reality of the indigenous people that inhabit these regions. Okay. So, how does a series of original cookbooks frame indigenous food practices? Let's look specifically at an example from Cocina Poblana. Oh, here's another picture. There she is with a very traditional kitchen. But let's zoom in onto Cocina Poblana and mole. So we all know mole, or we might not, but mole is a paste or a sauce that is placed over a protein, sometimes fish, sometimes chicken, sometimes turkey, but it is made with ground dried chili peppers and spices, sometimes just the ground chili peppers. So what I just described, there is nothing mestizo about that. Meaning there is no European influence in this particular dish. It can be paired with mestizo or indigenous influenced ingredients like bread or rice, but nothing of mole in and of itself is European. So how did they take mole and mesticize it? Tell it to the white people. Easy. We did it through lore. This is where the lore part of my title comes in. So here's the actual story itself. For those of you that can read Spanish, hop in there, but I'll summarize it. So the legend says that in New Spain, a order of nuns in the convent of Santa Rosa were visited by a bishop, and these nuns were in a tizzy because they didn't know what to feed a bishop. They were poor nuns. But this nun in particular had the bright idea, and guided by the spirits, started picking up some random ingredients, and naturally, just mole came out of her. And so it was celebrated as the regional dish, mole poblano. You can see that that is a lie. It was a whitewashing, a very explicit whitewashing of history. And Doña Josefina puts that front and center prior to the recipe. So that is the most egregious example of how she contributes. But let's not burn her at the stake yet, because Doña Josefina has a place in history and she has a place in academia. Her recipes are very detailed. You can tell that she really interviewed her contributors. Not just because of the measurements, but because of the methods that she describes on how to make these dishes. So what do? Well, I followed Doña Josefina's legacy, and where are they? That's Rick Bayless, very famous chef. He mentioned her in one of his interviews, kind of in an adventure story where he was tracking down one of her cookbooks. Diana Kennedy, and I didn't know this until I asked the librarian, donated most of the Doña Josefina's book to the archive. So what is the theme here? It's a theme of whiteness, and that these things aren't being recuperated to the people that they should be going through. So how do we decolonize this? We gotta give Doña Josefina back to the people that she took it from. And where is better than here? First, we gotta fund the library. It does us absolutely no good if these books are getting rained on, and there is no rare books library in UTSA. So first, fund the libraries. Second, teach a class on foodways that teaches this material to the people that need it the most. We have a large Oaxacan indigenous community here. Many of our students have Oaxacan indigenous heritage. These dishes, these practices should be going back to them. So don't leave it in the hands of the white people. Thank you.